It was a cold, gray November evening in 1986 when the Wexler family gathered for their annual Thanksgiving dinner in their quiet New England home. Outside, frost glistened on the windows and bare trees creaked in the bitter wind. Inside, the house was alive with warmth and cheer. The aroma of roasted turkey, spiced cider, and fresh baked pies filled the air, blending with the sound of laughter and the clinking of silverware. The Wexlers prided themselves on tradition, and every year they invited not just family, but also neighbors and friends who had nowhere else to go. That year, they had prepared for an intimate gathering of 10. The table was set, the fire crackled in the hearth, and everything seemed perfect, until a knock at the door shattered the festive mood. It was strange, Mrs. Wexler thought, since everyone who'd been invited had already arrived. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, thin, and unnervingly pale. His dark hair was slicked back, and he wore a suit that looked like it belonged in a black and white photograph. It was clean, but frayed at the edges, as though it had seen decades of wear. But it wasn't his attire that unsettled her. It was his eyes, deep, shadowed, and unblinking, as if they could see straight through her. The man smiled faintly. "I was invited," he said, his voice low and measured. "May I come in?" Mrs. Wexler hesitated. She didn't recall inviting anyone else, but it was Thanksgiving after all, a time for kindness and generosity. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. "Of course," she said softly. "Come in." As he crossed the threshold, a cold draft followed him into the house, causing the candles on the mantel to flicker. The lively chatter in the dining room quieted as the stranger entered, his presence commanding attention. The Wexler family greeted him politely, though their smiles faltered under his gaze. No one asked who he was, perhaps out of politeness or perhaps out of fear of the answer. The stranger took a seat at the table without waiting to be offered one, choosing a chair at the very end. As the meal began, he didn't touch the food. He merely sat there, his long fingers folded neatly in his lap, watching. It was as if he were an observer rather than a guest. Small talk attempted to break the tension, but the stranger's presence stifled the room. "So, where are you from?" Mr. Wexler asked at one point, trying to sound jovial. The stranger tilted his head, a faint smile curling his lips. "I've been here before," he replied cryptically. His voice sent a chill down their spines. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the stranger's silence, it was the way the room seemed darker, colder. The fire in the hearth sputtered as though struggling to stay lit. Mrs. Wexler noticed her youngest son shivering, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. When it came time for Mr. Wexler's Thanksgiving toast, he stood and raised his glass, his voice shaking slightly. "To family, friends, and the blessings we share," the stranger interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You shouldn't have invited me," he said softly, yet everyone heard him. "You don't know what you've done." The room fell silent. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of an unseen force. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles on the table. The temperature plummeted, and an oppressive sense of dread filled the air. Mrs. Wexler's eldest daughter, Clara, grabbed her father's arm. "Who is he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The stranger leaned forward, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "I'm here for what was promised," he said. The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, though no one had touched it. The family rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge no matter how hard they pulled. The stranger rose from his chair, his figure now towering and ominous. "It's too late," he said. "Once invited, I never leave empty-handed." Then, before their eyes, he vanished. One moment, he was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and decay. The Wexlers didn't sleep that night. They huddled together in their car, parked on the street, too afraid to remain in the house. When the sun rose, they cautiously returned, only to find everything seemingly back to normal, except for one chilling detail. The chair where the stranger had sat was blackened, the wood charred as if it had been struck by lightning. After that night, the Wexlers moved away, abandoning the house and never speaking of the incident again. But the story didn't end there. To this day, locals claim that every Thanksgiving, a tall, pale figure is seen wandering near the old Wexler property, waiting for someone to open the door and invite him in. So this Thanksgiving, when you hear a knock at your door, think carefully before you answer. Because not everyone who comes to your table is here to celebrate. But hey, if you like this video, please check out my other video on Is This Thanksgiving Story Too Creepy to Tell?